Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AXA Coral Live. It's fantastic to have you all with us. We are broadcasting from the CARMABI research station on the island of Curacao in the southern Caribbean. Now, today's lesson is all about life cycles and baby coral, and very shortly we will be introducing the fabulous Dr. Kristen Marhaver. But before that, a little bit of housekeeping and an introduction to where we are. Amazing to get all your questions coming in during this live lesson. There is an interaction box next to the live video stream. If you do have the video on full screen at the front of the classroom, then teachers or other adults can use a secondary device such as a mobile to access the question and answer section and to post any questions from students. We'll be coming to those in the latter section of this live lesson. If you do have any technical issues, there is a speech bubble sort of chat icon at the bottom right of every page. Click on that and we'll be able to help you with any of those tech issues you might be having. And I just coming to this term, sort of research station, what are we doing here in this amazing Marhaver lab on the island of Curacao? If you're studying the natural world and it's rightly getting more and more prominence in the news and in the conversations that people are having, looking after and understanding the natural world, it's really great to have basically these mini universities, these mini colleges next to the environment that you're studying. So CARMABI is one of those. It's one of the oldest research stations in the Caribbean. And just outside here, you'll have the amazing coral reef. But here, as you can see, is the ability not just to get out and collect your samples, but also to study them in more detail, whether that's here or in the wet lab with the aquaria just the other side of the building. It's wonderful to be in this community of scientists who are here sometimes for just a few weeks, sometimes for, I think, over 10 years or more, we'll find out in just a bit, who are working so hard to understand the natural world, the coral reef, and then putting that into helping little baby corals. So it's with great delight that I welcome Dr. Kristen Marhaver to AXA Coral Live. Good morning, Kristen. How are you?
Hi, Jamie. Welcome back to Curacao. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm so glad that our audience is back. It's been a long year, but we are really lucky to get to talk about corals today here in this awesome lab from CARMABI.
And Kristen, the lesson sort of life cycles and baby coral, I can remember when you study science at school, you have life cycles and you have baby animals and all that kind of good stuff. And then I started working on corals about 10 years ago, coral education. And everything I learned at school seemed to go a little bit wonky when we sort of look at coral. And what I really love about talking to you with Coral Live is you take the idea of school science and you sort of push it to its sort of complete limit into this super exciting world. Before we get into the science piece, and I know that Super Ellie behind the camera has got lots of footage of the reef from around here. I wanted to sort of start on a sort of personal, emotional note and just have a look at the coral reef and to get a sense of how it makes you feel.
Ooh, how a coral reef makes you feel?
Yeah.
You didn't tell me this question ahead of time.
No. What was it like on the first dive? What does it feel like when? I mean, for me, it's just so. It's like a Disney decided to make nature.
It's Disney in real life. How does a coral reef make me feel? Well, to be honest, the first time I ever went diving, I was very cold and I was pretty scared. I wasn't very comfortable. I was 15 years old, real tiny, and I had this big chunky dive gear on my body and this little tiny wetsuit, and the water was pretty cold. And I think the whole time I was just kind of trying to get my bearings. You know, my mask is filling with water because it was too wide for my face, and I was not one of those people who started out in love with the ocean when I was a little kid. So it was very weird and strange and uncomfortable the first time I was ever scuba diving. But I think after 10 or 15 or 20 times, I started to be more comfortable and more relaxed, and I started to look forward to that moment when you plunge into the water and there's bubbles everywhere and the sound changes and the color changes, the light changes, and I started to really, really love that switch into the underwater world. And now part of my job is to scuba dive at night, and so I get that same feeling, but it's at night. You're walking into this dark, inky water with a flashlight in your hand and your dive gear on, and when you go underneath, it's a whole entire other world, bubbly, there's reef noises, the lights look different. Just the experience of being underwater is really different and surreal and interesting, and it's very relaxing too. So when I think about a coral reef, mostly I feel kind of a relax.
Because I think when we sort of we talk about the natural world, it is that relaxation, that joy, that sort of beauty. And I wanted to sort of preface that because I know there's these big conversations going on around the world, especially with the climate conference in Glasgow at the moment about, you know, we need to do this, we need to do that, but it's just joyous. A lot of seeing. I mean, I went past the point, saw a big bit of coral out there last night, and just went, yes, this is nice.
Yeah.
And what we're going to do today is really talk about the biology of how that world is created.
How it's created. I agree. I think that one of the reasons we keep nature around, why we protect it, is because it's a place where we go to relax and feel human and feel connected to the world. And part of that connection is the wonder, realizing we're this tiny little bit of history, and the Earth's history is so much bigger and so much more complicated than our little tiny bit of it. So that's one of the most interesting things in science to me is, how did you get this coral reef? Where did it come from? How could it possibly be real? And we're going to try to investigate a little bit of that today.
So when I did life cycles at school, I think I was on frogs.
Frogs.
So I did an egg, a tadpole, sort of halfway in between tadpole frog. You know, the sort of has legs and a tail, not quite sure what's happening, and then a frog.
Yeah, frog, egg with legs, frog.
Yeah, and it goes. Is that this? I mean, take us through what happens with the coral animal. I mean, is that the same thing that's going on, or is there something else happening here?
Let's see. So if it was the same, we would have coral,
Yep.
egg with legs,
Yeah.
coral.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what happens.
Okay.
There's a bunch of other stuff that happens, and all of it is really cool and really interesting. So we're going to go through the life cycle of the coral and examine where it diverges from egg with legs, the tadpole model. Where should we start?
Well, should we start with the coral animal, because that's the kind of beginning. So for those classes, and I know the wonderful Penthorpe School are with us again today. Hi, everyone there. That we did, we made a coral polyp out of a banana and some gummy straws and some green sugar sprinkles and that kind of thing. So we've got a handle on sort of the coral as an animal.
We've got that.
We've got that.
We've got that. Okay, so we're starting with the coral animal.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a reef covered in corals.
Mm-hmm.
They're all different species.
Okay.
But each species has to figure out how to make baby corals.
Uh-huh.
Just like frogs are trying to make baby frogs, and birds are trying to make baby birds.
Yeah.
So the most common way that a coral starts the process of making more corals is a process called mass spawning. So instead of a bird laying an egg in a nest, or instead of a frog laying an egg in a pond, corals do something else. They just spray all their eggs into the ocean all at once in 1 second, and then they let them go. So instead of sitting on an egg for 2 months, if you're a bird, you just put your eggs in the air, put them in the water, and hope it works out. So Ellie's going to show us a video of coral spawning, a big, huge boulder coral of thousands and thousands of coral mouths. And each of those mouths is going to spit out a ball of 100 eggs that's glued together with sperm cells. And that's going to happen in coordination with all the other corals on the reef. So your frog is now spitting out a ball of eggs that's just flying into the water, never to be seen again. So it's already pretty different.
Okay. Are we going? We're rolling. Okay, so we've got this, you know, not what one would call sort of a close parental relationship.
Right. Right. Yeah. The parenthood phase of the coral life lasts for about 1 or 2 seconds. Like, oh, here's my egg, bloop, and then it's gone.
And then it's gone, and then so it's into the water, and I'm imagining that instead of like a bird might lay 6, 8 eggs or something, a sort of hatch, and you know, 2 of those will survive to adulthood. The coral's got a different strategy. Let's go for 1 million.
Way different strategy, yeah. If you want one baby to survive, you better make 1 million. Because it's not very easy to survive in the ocean if you're a coral baby. So each of these coral animals that's spawning, each of these little tiny mouths is releasing 100 or 500 eggs, and then that's happening on a colony that can have thousands of polyps. So hundreds of thousands or millions of eggs, poof, into the water.
And then they're floating around. Where do they go?
Where do they go?
Or what happens next? What's the next chapter?
There's a really hard answer and a really easy answer. We don't know. But the first thing they do is go to the surface of the ocean.
Okay.
So the eggs are full of fat, and fat floats on water. And so the eggs go to the surface of the water, and then they mingle and they mix up and they swirl around with all of the other eggs and sperm from all the other colonies that spawned that day, that night. And then they go through the process of development. So this is a part where we might be a little bit familiar. 1 egg turns into 2 cells, turns into 4 cells. And Ellie has a cool animation of that for us, showing what happens with a coral. But that's sped up hundreds of times. So it takes 12 or 18 hours, sometimes 2 days, to go from 1 cell, dividing 2, 4, 8, 16, over and over and over until you get to many thousands of cells. So that part is actually pretty similar to frogs or to humans. It's just that for corals, that's happening at the surface of the ocean, and not in a pond or in a womb.
And so that process, because we sort of learn about sort of life cycle in stages, but in fact it's a continuous process rather than the 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to whatever. So when do we say it reaches the next stage? When does that 1,000 cells become other than just a developed egg?
When does it switch from a developed egg to a baby coral?
Yeah.
Usually about 1 day after spawning, that ball of cells starts to grow little hairs called cilia.
Okay.
And they start to move. And so that ball of cells has turned from just a bunch of cells trying to organize themselves to a organized ball of cells with little hairs. And that's right before it turns into a proper coral larva.
Okay.
So within a few hours, maybe 1 more day, that ball of cells that's starting to move becomes a long kind of tadpole-shaped, worm-shaped larva with lots and lots of hairs on its body, and it uses those hairs to swim. So Ellie has a video of coral larvae swimming. They look like little teardrops or like little gumdrops maybe, and they've got thousands and thousands of hairs on their sides, and those are all beating rapidly, and that's how that little tiny larva can move around. It's not even 1 millimeter wide though. It's if you look at your fingerprints, it's like 1.5 fingerprint ridges.
Wow.
Big.
That's tiny.
Small. But it can swim. It's a baby animal and it can swim.
It's a baby animal, it can swim, there's ocean currents, there's so much going on. Where does it want to go?
That's a good question. Yeah, where where it does go is sometimes into the middle of the ocean to be
Okay.
eaten by a whale shark or zapped by the sun. But where it wants to go is an awesome coral reef with other corals and with clean water and with food to eat. So that little baby animal, even though it's only 1.5 fingerprint grooves big, it's got thousands of hairs and it's got little cells all over its body that can sense light and sound and colors and bacteria. And it uses all of those cells to try to find its way around and to try to navigate toward a coral reef.
And so how and it just knows where the coral reef is?
Kind of. It's got a lot of evolution behind it that helps it find a coral reef. No brain, but it's got cells that can respond to light or to temperature or to sound. So when it's near, say, an island, it can probably smell that there's more food in the water. It can probably see that the water is changing from blue to more purples and yellows. And because of those signals coming in, it can decide where to swim.
Amazing.
That's pretty cool.
And so it finds home, and then it smushes.
And then it smushes. We have a really cool video of the smush process,
Okay.
which I had never really gotten to see in my research and my coral species that I study until this year. So Ellie's going to show us a video of a coral larva searching for where to stick, where to smush, and then deciding on the place and then smushing into a polyp. Kind of looks like it goes from a worm shape to like a dumpling shape.
And we've got this science word, sessile, which we can start to unpack because there aren't that many animals. Like most of the animals that you study at school move around a lot, but we have this word sessile, which describes most coral. What's that all about? I mean, there's a smush, and then that's it for 500 years.
That's it. Yeah, you're hitting on something really important. This phase of being a larva is pretty much the only time a coral can move.
Okay.
So it would be like you were born and you had about a week to decide where you would attach to the world, and then you would never move again. So it's a really important decision because do you want to be somewhere protected or do you want to be somewhere out where there's lots of space? Do you want lots of food? Do you want to be hiding from predators? Do you want it to be shady? Do you want to be in the sun? That little tiny coral larva, 1.5 fingerprint grooves long, has to decide where in the ocean to stick, and then it's stuck. And it's pretty much there for the rest of its life.
We've seen the video of this amazing varied coral reef, and I've got this conception of this smushed, microscopic gummy drop. How's that working out?
That's the hardest part to imagine. It still amazes me that our little smushed gumdrop of coral can grow into something the size of this room even. Mostly the answer is a lot of time and a lot of luck. But finally, because of all the work of scientists all around the world, and divers and hobbyists and aquarium keepers, we now have, we've been able to watch that process all the way through. So we can show some videos of what happens next. So we were a larva, now we're a settled polyp. We call that the primary polyp stage. Now we got to grow. We're like 1.5 fingerprint grooves wide. In the first few days after settlement, the polyp is going to grow 2 or 3 times bigger, using mostly just the fat that came in the polyp, just the same fats that helped it float when it was getting fertilized, the same fats that helped it find energy to swim when it was a larva. Now it's going to use those fats to get bigger and make a mouth, make tentacles, make a little gut. So Ellie has a video of 4 different scenes of a polyp going from day 1 to day 2 to day 3 to day 4.
Amazing.
That gets us to about the 3 fingerprint groove size, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe 2.
Maybe 2. and then of course, because we have you know, this sort of almost like a, you know, the opposite of a Spice Girls song, you know, four become one, it's one becomes four. What's
one turns into four. Yeah, this is the most amazing part of the process to me, I think, is that one tiny little polyp is going to start eating.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to get algae that live in its skin. We'll come back to that. And it's going to start making copies of itself. And it has to do all those things in a really busy, diverse ocean full of predators and competitors. And then it has to do that for a few hundred years. So we don't have a video that's 200 years long, but we have some videos of the first part of the process. Then you can imagine the last 500 years of it. So the first thing we have is a polyp that's eating.
Uh-huh.
So it's only a few fingerprint grooves wide, but it's an animal. It has a mouth, it has a gut, a stomach,
Mm-hmm.
it has tentacles, and so it can eat just like we can or a
Okay.
frog. So they're eating food while they're sitting on the reef, and
Yep.
they're using that food to grow bigger, just like we do. But they also use a special trick. They don't just rely on eating food. They also put the algae in their skin, and then they make the algae make them food. They make the algae make them food. Yeah.
Okay, because the students watching will have this idea of photosynthesis and may even know the chemical formula, but essentially that carbon dioxide, water, sun power, sugar.
You got it.
And that's what corals are just taking all the sugar for themselves rather than letting the plant-like algae have it.
It's sometimes more cooperative than that, but there's definitely an exchange of goods and services happening. So I think Ellie has a video of a coral polyp that has some algae in its tentacles. Those algae are doing photosynthesis, just like you described, and they're making some sugars that the coral uses. So it would be like you had grass or lettuce or spinach living in your skin, and then if you were hungry, you could just kind of go out to the sun and get a little bit of extra sugar that way. They're also doing really cool cell biology things, like they're sharing vitamins and they're sharing nitrogen, and the coral is giving the algae a place to live that's protected from the rest of the world. So they're cooperating, but it's a pretty complicated cooperation as well. It's pretty cool of the corals that they can outsource some of the food production to their skin lettuce.
And we're still on one polyp here, or?
We're still on one polyp, but we're just about to divide into two polyps.
Okay.
So we stopped talking about our frog a long time ago, but at this point the frog has swam all the way across the ocean, glued itself to one place, made the first half of a gut, but not the second half. It just spits anything else back out its mouth that it doesn't need. Arms around its mouth, algae living in its skin.
Okay.
Now make a perfect copy of itself and keep it here, and then here, and then do that a few thousand times. So it's different than a frog.
So you're telling me that the coral, having like reproduced in the way that we know that most animals reproduce, then sits somewhere and then clones itself 1,000 times.
And then clones itself. So it does a normal kind of animal reproduction where there's a male cell and a female cell, and then that baby, once it's on the reef, does clonal propagation, clonal reproduction. It just makes perfect copies of itself. So it would be like you stayed on this bench for 100 more years, and then every few months you made another small Jamie kind of growing out of your shoulder until there was just like a pile of like 200,000 Jamies. And at that point, we would probably have to sort of compete with you for space to.
Yeah, it's a frightening thought in its own right, but yeah, so we'll keep the analogy going in terms of competition. We've got these big groups of corals who are starting to compete on the reef, but the ones we've seen on the videos are quite sort of jelly, sort of smudgy-like.
Yes.
But the ones, when we look at the reef, they're these amazing sort of almost underwater sort of natural buildings.
That's a good point. I forgot that you also have to grow a skeleton underneath yourself and then leave it behind. So you are gooey, but then the Jamie skeleton is underneath you, and you have to keep adding to that pile. We have a visual aid.
We have a visual aid.
We have a
Excellent.
visual aid. I think this one is a good one. We use this one a lot on Coral Live because it shows so much. So say your original frog, or Jamie, or coral, was down here, then eventually this one original coral split into two.
Okay.
And then this one split into two, and then this one split into two, and this one split into two. So if you imagine each of these are, frogs glued to the bottom of a pond, or Jamie's glued to the lab floor, you just keep making more and more copies, but they're all genetically the same. So this one looks like Jamie, and this one, and this one. If we sampled your DNA, that would all be you. And then this is one way to do it, but you can also grow more attached. So you have to decide if you want to be a branching Jamie that sort of branches, or if you want to be like a boulder, like a mountainous Jamie where there's just like face over and over and over again.
And
leave your skeleton behind underneath.
Why, from a sort of environmental biology point of view, would I make this kind of choice if there was like stronger waves coming at me so I could resist it? Or what, I mean, is there a reason? Like I'd be a branching one because I could go a bit faster and maybe get above somebody, or?
Yeah, those are great intuitions. There are lots of different reasons for corals to pick the shape that they pick. And maybe the best way to think about it is like plants.
Mm-hmm.
Some plants are just short grasses or little small bushes, and they grow fast and they spread quickly and they can fragment. Little bits can move around. And then other plants just grow and grow and grow and grow, like a redwood or like a mahogany tree. They don't fragment and roll around. They just try to get as big as possible and be as sturdy as possible.
Or oak or a beech for those in the UK. I'm familiar with mahogany and redwoods.
I'm trying to think of a tropical tree.
Yeah.
An oak. So here we've got the oak, and then maybe this one is more like a shrub that can break apart, that grows a little bit faster. But in a really, really nasty storm, this one might not do so well.
Got it.
This one's gonna hold up. And scientists are finding that this shape of coral helps stop a lot of wave energy coming toward shore. We used to think this was most of the wave energy stopping with all this open space, but these also stop a ton of wave energy. So in addition to all the other things they're doing, corals are also basically making a big breakwater that protects everything behind them.
I mean, I know we've got some specific lessons on what's termed ecosystem goods and services, but when we started off talking about joy, but it's also security that the coral reef provides for those millions who live, near the coast in tropical areas.
Yeah, being big and huge and heavy is the ecosystem service because it stops waves, which are big and huge and heavy, and everything on shore is more protected the more corals you have in front of those waves.
Amazing. So I think we have the opportunity to see some science in action.
Some science in action.
Yeah.
We've made it to the multi-polyp stage. The next thing they do is just grow and grow and grow.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is that they eat while they're growing. So I think we're going to feed some baby corals on camera. And we have a few right behind us here. For friends who've been watching Coral Live over the years, some of you were with us when these corals were just first born, 1 month old or 1 year old. And so some of our longtime Coral Live fans are getting to see the corals now that they're 2 and 3 years old and see how much they grew. So we're trying to show you the process. It's just going to take 100 years of Coral Live until we get to this size.
This side. Well, there we go. Chris, just while we get set up and sort of move cameras around, how many coral babies have you sort of raised over the past 10 years?
I have no idea.
Are we talking hundreds of thousands, millions?
We have raised millions of larvae in the lab, and we don't try to keep all those alive here, so a lot of those larvae go right back into the ocean the next day. And we do see baby corals out here of those same species. So we've sent millions of corals into the ocean. CARMABI and its collaborators have planted thousands, probably. But more important than that is teaching everyone else how we do it so that everyone else can do it too.
Brilliant. So we've got,
Here comes Ellie with her camera,
yeah,
and we're going to
bring these perches out of the way.
bring the camera to the corals.
So these, I can see some are tiny, tiny, tiny. One looks really big, and one looks like a sort of a series of sort of, I don't know, like the size of a sort of oat flake.
Yeah, that's a good summary. That's a good summary, Jamie. So this coral here on the left, that one is 3 years old. And same with these 3 corals as well. They're all different species, but they're all about the same age. I'm blocking the light a little bit. And then those 2 smaller ones, they're about 2 years old. So you can see just from here to here. Remember when we were 1 month old, we were still the size of 2 fingerprint grooves. And then after 2 years, I can put my fingerprints in here to show you. So after 2 years, now you're the size of a whole fingernail. And after 3 years is when they really start getting going. So this one is, now it looks like a proper coral. It's growing some height, and it's got dozens of polyps, and it's well on its way to becoming 100 or 500 years old. And then these other species here are just different species. This is one called pineapple coral that CARMABI raised for the first time anywhere in the world. And it's pretty slow growing, but it's very sturdy. They've been very easygoing and pretty easy to keep alive. This one here is one of the biggest, most important corals in the Caribbean because it grows to be 1,000 years old, and it can be just super abundant on a reef. It's very common, and they get huge. Then this coral over here, this is pillar coral. These are endangered. There's very few of them left, and they have a very hard time reproducing on their own. So having pillar corals that we can raise in the lab is a really important step in preserving their genetic diversity. And then this one doesn't quite look like it yet, but this is going to be a brain coral. So it's just starting to make its grooves, its little brain-shaped squiggles that'll look like a brain coral eventually. So you can see the diversity of the colors that they have. Now what we're going to do is we're going to feed them some food. So we have tweezers, and we have a mussel like you would eat mussels and fries, maybe if you were in France. And certainly a lot of marine organisms like to eat mussels as well. Lots of fat, some protein. We're going to feed a couple of these corals and see if they're ready for some breakfast. So probably the best way is to start with this one because it's so big and its mouths are so obvious. Here we go, watch this. You see its tentacles are folding in on that food. The coral next to it can smell that something is happening. So we'll give this a piece of food too. Watch this. There it goes. That one is very hungry. That one's very, very excited to have a little snack. So we'll put a few more of these pieces here and watch this. Ellie's doing an awesome job taking video of this over our shoulders.
Just incredible.
Oh, do you see that one polyp is all closed up because it's got food inside it? Now the one next to it gets to have a little snack. Now normally corals don't eat things quite this big. They can also eat plankton, they can eat bacteria. So they're really opportunistic, which means that they kind of go with the flow. Whatever comes by, whatever's around, they'll try to eat it. They can also eat a lot and then wait a long time for the next food to come by. So they're very good at living in clear water with not very much food, and then eating a whole bunch when they have a chance. Now this is going to be, let's see, it's going to be harder to feed this little tiny polyp coral, but we can try it. Let's see if we can see any of it. Oh, that's going to be too big. I think we need smaller coral food for this coral. Do this one.
And is the feeding happening the whole time, or is it sort of happening at night, or normally? I mean, I know you probably have a different sort of feeding schedule here in the lab, but are they sort of just whenever a meal coming past, let's just go for it?
Yeah, they can eat if say a fish gets attacked by another fish up in the water column. There might be little tiny bits of scales or little tiny bits of fish that kind of sprinkle onto the reef. A coral can eat that. If a big plume of plankton comes up from the deep sea at night, the corals can feed on that. So they can be very flexible about when they eat and what they eat. I would say mostly they're eating at night because that's when there's the most plankton in the water. And that's when it's a little safer to put your tentacles out in the water and not get bitten. But they can be very flexible. They're, one of the reasons that they've been on Earth for hundreds of millions of years is that they can adapt to lots of different situations.
Amazing. And we've got some amazing questions coming through as well.
All right, excellent. The questions get harder and harder every year, so I hope that I know how to answer them this year.
Can I just give that to you?
Sure.
If you wanted to
Go like this.
perfect. So just handing the mic over to Kristen so we get her fantastic answers. Inverclyde Academy would love to know, what does coral need to reproduce successfully? There seems to be a lot of luck going on here, and it's just it's like playing the lottery. If I buy 14 billion tickets, one of them's going to be a winner.
Right.
Is that what's going on, or is there a little bit more, you know, that if there's a healthy environment, there's a sort of bigger context going on?
That's a great question. What does it take to succeed when you're doing coral reproduction, when you're a coral trying to make babies? When they're spawning their eggs, the two most important things are to have lots of individuals, lots of possible mates, and to have really clean, healthy, clear seawater. So you can imagine if you are trying to get your, Ellie's pointing us at the camera that we're going to, and that's why we're adjusting. So if you can imagine that you are trying to find somebody to be your partner for the rest of your life, you're going to be a little bit picky. You want to pick a good mate. Well, corals can't see their partners, but they're making eggs that can only get fertilized by some cells and not others. So the more individuals on a reef, the more genetic diversity you have on a reef, the more likely you're going to find a good match for the eggs. So that's really important. And that's one of the reasons we worry about coral spawning. Well, it's the reason we worry about coral populations, because we need lots of corals on each reef for them to successfully get their eggs fertilized. Then we need very clean water. So no sewage, no fertilizer from golf courses, no sediment from construction on the beach. All of those things interrupt the ability of the coral to survive in that really early stage where they're very delicate and they're dividing really fast. And then the same is true on the other side. When they come to settle onto a reef, you need lots of corals because you need the support system for corals. You need the algae that go in their skin, you need the snails and the shrimp that clean around their edges, you need the urchins that grind their reef clean, and then you need the smells. So a reef smells a certain way, and corals use that smell to find their way to a reef. All of that is basically saying coral reproduction does best when there's big, healthy coral reefs with lots of corals.
And I know that you and the wider team here at CARMABI have been sort of giving the reefs that may not be as amazing as they have been in the past a little bit of a helping hand as we also on land try and change our activities to make the ocean healthier.
Yes, exactly. The number one thing we can do for coral reefs is protect them now and not let them slide. The other thing we can do for coral reefs is stop climate change and level this planet off, calm it down, cool it down, give the corals a stable temperature to survive. But in places where we've lost a lot, we're also trying to figure out ways that we can jumpstart and boost the recovery. So if you can imagine a place in your city or your town where they just cut all the trees down, all the plants just stripped bare, you could wait for that to grow back into a forest, which could take 100 years, or you could go plant a few saplings and a few trees and a few bushes, and you could try to boost that recovery. So what a lot of scientists in Curacao and all around the world are trying to work on now is ways that we can push that process forward. And it's very difficult because we just talked about the scale of it, how huge the ocean is, how small corals are. But we've seen now places where the boost from humans has made a really big difference.
Amazing. There's some tough questions
Oh
here.
no! Oh no!
So I'm going to go for the home edders, who would love to know how long does it take for coral to fully mature?
Oh, that's such a good question. How long until from a coral being a baby that's born until it can have babies itself?
Yes.
We think that the smallest corals, the really tiny ones, they only get this big when they're mature, maybe 2 years.
Okay.
But the corals like this, maybe 4, 6, 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not that far from closing the loop a couple of times. There are corals that our friends from Secor planted here 10 years ago, and they started spawning when they were 4. And now those corals have babies that live in Florida that were part of a project that we did here at CARMABI.
Amazing.
So restoration babies that had restoration babies.
Brilliant. Love it. Inverclyde Academy would like to know how far can coral travel when it's a baby?
How far can coral travel when it's a baby? If a coral is swimming, so say you just keep it in a water that's not moving, it can swim 200 to 400 meters a day. So if you've ever been near like a soccer pitch or a football field, maybe one huge loop around there is how much they can swim, which is actually a lot.
That is a lot.
That's a lot. But then the water's also moving. So ocean currents can move 10 centimeters a second. They can move a meter a second. And some of these larvae can survive for a month before they have to settle. So if it's swimming 400 meters in a day, if it's floating in the currents, kilometers and kilometers in a day, which means the corals that we make here on our reefs in Curacao are dispersing to other islands all around the Caribbean. And that's sort of a good example of how we're all linked together in helping preserve them and grow them back, because our corals are going to go to other islands.
And the same for other islands coming here. And so this reinforces the need to have that good sort of starter plot. So going back to our idea of the forest being cut down, if you then tarmac it over, then there's no chance of things coming back. But if you make it ready for a nice place for plants to grow, then that's super important too.
Absolutely. If you had a neighbor with a really big, huge fruit tree that was sort of dropping fruit into your yard, and every once in a while you got a little baby tree, imagine that your neighbor cut everything down in their yard. Now you wouldn't have any seeds coming into your yard. So it all spreads from one island to another, one backyard to another.
Really lovely question here, which is basically about this interplay between what nature can do by itself and the restoration work of by people and by groups. What would we? Is it really necessary to do restoration, or is it more important to just keep off nature and just give it time to do its own thing?
Yeah, how should we spend our effort? Should it be about conservation, or should we try to do restoration? The way I like to think about it is nobody ever wants to be in a car accident. Nobody ever wants to have a heart attack. So we work really hard to prevent car accidents. We work really hard to convince people to exercise and to eat well. But car accidents still happen, heart attacks still happen, and when you go to the emergency room, you want a ton of science and a ton of medicine there ready to save your life. So we have conservation of what we have left and global conservation initiatives to prevent coral reefs from declining and to help them grow back on their own. But we also are inventing technologies to save those ones that are right on the edge of going, or to build back reefs that have really lost a lot. And I don't really see those in conflict, because they're two different skill sets. It's different kinds of science. It's different kinds of expertise. So more of both is, I think, what we want.
Amber, we've got time for just one more question, and it is coral a good indicator of ocean health?
Is coral a good indicator of ocean health? Yes, if you're near a coral reef. Corals only grow in a little tiny piece of the ocean that's really warm with really clear water. So if you went to a lake in Minnesota, or if you went to a stream in a bog in the Netherlands, a stream in the UK, you would not be looking for corals as a sign of water health. But if you're in a place where corals can grow, then yes.
I'm just going to add that one of the ways I think this question comes from is that do corals act as sort of an early warning system? Are they sort of quite fragile, fussy little creatures that say, okay, when you see us decline, then something seriously.
Yeah, that can be true. Every reef has a few very sensitive species, and they tend to be the ones that die back or suffer or start growing more slowly when the reef is affected by sewage and pollution and heating events. So seeing corals start to slide backward is definitely a sign that something is going wrong. It'd be kind of like if you have a plant at your house and it starts to wither and wilt and the leaves start to fall off, you have to check and see what you might be doing wrong before the whole thing goes.
Kristen, thank you so much for sharing with us. I think the importance of seeing how complex and diverse the natural world is, how exciting biology can be, breaking free of some of the things that you learn about in at school, that there's more and more to be working on, and it's just, I just love watching sort of feeding coral babies. Absolutely amazing, and thank you so much for being part of Coral Live once again.
I'm so glad that you're back, Jamie, and I'm also so glad that our audience is back. I know we've got some Coral Live followers from over the years, and we're going to keep doing this for 100 years until there is a pile of 500 Jamies sitting here in the lab. So I hope that you'll join us on the next episodes this week, but also come back next year and see how much Jamie's gotten bigger.
That's very kind. I think it's probably time to stop these live broadcasts if a clone grows out of my shoulder. But it's fascinating to hear about the diversity of life on our wonderful planet. Thank you so much for being part of AXA Coral Live today, and do join us tomorrow when we'll be looking at science careers and then food webs on Thursday. But for now, it's goodbye from Coral Live and goodbye from Curacao. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.